Kevon, we spoke to Jenemiu a few weeks ago about sort of the unique impact of purity culture on Black America. I'm curious what you can tell our audience about how the pressure on sexual purity might look different in Black communities.
Well, it's from my experience, it's just a lot. I feel like it seems like there's this tendency towards everyone being exactly the same, and this sort of standard of not deviating from the heteronormative, standard.
Hmm.
Even within the Black atheist community, a little bit, not everyone, of course, but even within the Black atheist community, we see a lot of people just sticking to the standard heteronormative, like, this is what we do. You can't do anything else, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so there's just a greater pressure maybe to stay in line within a smaller community.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's seen as deviant or weird, or one person even told me that that being gay is European influences. So I guess there's a bit of, like, yeah, there's a bit of that in there.
Sure. Well, so then how does that purity culture carry over then to homophobia in Black culture?
Well, a lot of times, of course, if you are, gay or bi, trans, you get excluded from your family. I mean, a lot of your viewers are probably familiar with that because they're in the atheist community. But
Sure.
yeah, it can be isolating for a lot of people,
Mm.
and it just doesn't help build community.
Sure. Yeah. How have you noticed homophobia changing recently in Black communities? Nationally, it feels like we are becoming more accepting. There's more representation in film. Like, things are definitely not in a place that I'm excited about, especially when we start talking about trans folks and what we see coming through the legislatures right now, which, real quick aside to the audience, look at what state you're in, look at what's coming up in your legislature and get involved because, ooh, is it messy. Anyway, sorry, back to our conversation. Have you seen much shift or change in the last 5, 10 years in terms of homophobia in Black culture?
I think it's definitely decreased. I think overall, like you said, in America, it's definitely decreased, and definitely within the Black community, it's way less than it used to be. But still, it's still prevalent, unfortunately. But going down, hopefully, we can change that a bit more today or in going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. How would you then compare queer acceptance in Black culture versus the American culture at large?
I think in Black culture, especially within the church, it's much less accepted. Unless, I mean, what I've noticed is among people that I know who are gay but don't identify as such, as long as you don't say you're gay in the church, they're sort of okay with that.
Sure.
That kind of thing. But
There's a little bit more of like a don't ask, don't tell type
yeah,
of
basically,
policy there.
they know, but if as long as you don't say it, no one questions it. As long as you act a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're not allowed to be like out and proud.
Yeah.
There was kind of something like that in my old church community as a Jehovah's Witness. There were young people that I grew up with who definitely had characteristics and mannerisms and ways of talking and acting that made people kind of like, that's like a queer kid, but nobody said it. And they sure didn't say it. And when I came out to my parents as bi, obviously I'm mixed. I grew up in a mixed race household, but my parents unanimously pretty much took the stance of like, you may be attracted to women, but you don't have to go around calling yourself bi. It's like,
but that's what that means, though. That's what that's called.
Right.
Yeah, well, it's not a matter of whether or not the label applies. It's a matter of whether or not you choose to apply that label to yourself.
Sure.
I think is the thing there.
Right.
And
It's very surface level. It's very behavior driven. I forgot the technical term for that. I know Matt Delancey references that all the time, but I forget the behavior versus ideology. I forget what that's called.
but it's definitely
Orthopraxy, I think.
That might
versus
be it.
There's a
orthodoxy.
$5 word. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Somebody correct us in the chat if we totally have the wrong word.
Yeah.
Well, it makes me curious then how queer representation in film compares against the wider culture. You know, in the notes and in like the Facebook promotions and all of this stuff, I kind of crack some jokes about Tyler Perry, and I definitely don't mean to make him the sole arbiter or representative of Black film culture. But I did have the very unfortunate experience of being forced to watch all of Diary of a Mad Black Woman a couple of months ago. And Jesus, is that rough to watch. So it made me really curious about what queer representation, what trans representation, or these different things looks like in particular when we're talking about Black film or Black media.
Yeah, it's hard for me to speak specifically on that because that's I don't identify as queer, but so I'm not like always on the lookout. Mostly like what I notice is when something like someone says something or does something and it's like that's not right. So I mostly notice that. But as far as Tyler Perry, I've been privileged enough to never see any of his movies.
Hey, congratulations.
But I don't see in general, just as like a media consumer, like I don't see a lot of representation. I know there's that one character on Orange is the New Black who's trans, and people like mostly support like that one particular actor. But
Laverne Cox, love her,
but
love her.
But like that's the exception, it seems.
Yeah, I there's not a whole lot of rep, and it's in the same way that I've noticed that there's a lot of actors who are queer that don't specifically get mentioned as being queer because they don't look or act a certain way. Maybe they have heteronormative relationships that are public most of the time, but like I remember the first time I heard like Channing Tatum is bisexual, I was like,
Well,
What?
that's a fantasy I did not know that I had. Okay, thank you for that.
You're welcome, Christy. You're welcome. But I have found that that's the case with a lot of Black actors that I'm familiar with as well. It's like, oh, well, that person is non-binary, and I had no clue because they always get cast in female roles with female pronouns, and nobody seems to, and they're always referred to in interviews that way. It's like, if you're not like Elliot Page about it, if you're not like fully like, I am coming out, this is my big thing, then it's like nobody just acknowledges it. You're just there.
Yeah.
You're there and you're being queer, but you're not loud enough to actually get labeled as a queer in the media. I don't know.
Sure. Well, and it creates this this strange dichotomy. It feels like, you know, you mentioned Orange is the New Black, and with shows like Pose on HBO and these different things, it feels like there is decent-ish, you know, The Handmaid's Tale and these different things. There's like decent-ish representation of queer Black folks, but in media that is pretty bougie, that is like largely directed towards a very white audience. I don't know. I'm curious. I don't really see that kind of thing coming up on BET. And I recognize my ignorance here, and I recognize that there's a lot more to the story. But when I think about, for instance, like Dear White People or something along those lines, that strikes me as a show that's largely directed towards white audiences. And even if the representation of queer Black folks on that show is pretty positive, I'm curious how much of that is really being given or shown to largely Black audiences. And I don't know that we can measure that or how to even really wrap our heads around that, but it's definitely something that I'm curious about.
Yeah, a lot of content is generally geared towards, I mean, Black people are what, 13% of the country. A lot of content is just naturally geared towards, you know, non-Black people in general. But I think they probably most likely do a lot of, I mean, I used to work for a market research company. We did focus groups all the time. I'm sure they do focus groups where they probably figure that, you know, Black people aren't so interested in this content, and they're not going to push content towards demographics they don't think will be profitable, which is sort of sad reflection that, they feel like, we won't be interested in that type of content. And they might be sort of right on some levels.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Sony document leak a couple of years ago when it came out that there were all of these beliefs about whether or not Black actors, for instance, could pilot large movies overseas, and will Chinese audiences accept Black stars, and these different things. And the truth generally is, yeah, maybe not exactly at first, but if you put it out there, eventually people will come, and it becomes this very like self-fulfilling prophecy in a lot of ways.
Yeah, like if you never try, how are you going to know? And like you were saying earlier with these sort of the media that does have Black queer representation being marketed sort of more towards a white audience, in the same way, I think that they are marketed towards a specifically progressive audience. Like, if you're not already down with Black people and trans people and gay people, the rest of the show's content probably isn't going to interest you either. Is something that I've noticed. And as much as I enjoy those kinds of shows, I'm like, yeah, this is great, but the people who need to hear these messages, this show isn't really for them.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, these ideas about, focus group panels and the market research and all of this, I think just really serves to highlight that outside racism is a major factor on homophobia within the queer community, or within the Black community, rather. And it is it's frustrating to know that, a lot of folks are dealing with that sort of double damage in that way. But I'm wondering what that outside pressure might be looking like.
I mean, a lot of it's religious pressure. I mean, it definitely, it's not all religious, like I said. I've met and dealt with a lot of Black, not a lot, but some Black atheists who are homophobic. But I think a lot of it stems from religion. And even with the Black atheists, I think a lot of that can also be maybe residual. I'm not sure what their motives are or why they don't accept certain things. But I think a lot of it definitely comes from religion and the way people are taught to I don't think if we lived in a magical world where there was never any religion, it's hard for me to imagine there'd be homophobia.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. Certainly not organized on the levels that it is. That's a very complex anthropological discussion that, boy, I'm not going to put the audience through tonight as I sort of like awkwardly stumble through it. But put a beer in my hand and sit me down in front of a fire and start asking me those questions. And yeah, we'll go to town. For now, I definitely want to talk a little bit more about homophobia within Black atheism, but I'm curious, first and foremost, Kevon, as an organizer within these communities, what sorts of homophobia you're witnessing yourself, or what some of those experiences have been that you've been witness to?
Well, as an organizer for Black non-believers, in order to join the group, we ask a short survey, like literally like 3 questions. The first one is, when did you become an atheist? And, it's pretty straightforward. The second one is, because we're a 501c3, we can't, we even if we could, we wouldn't, but we can't exclude anyone. So people who aren't Black are also welcome to join the group. So, we make sure people are comfortable. Are you comfortable with, non-Black members? The third question is about the LGBT community. And this is where a lot of people lose it. I've had people respond with everything from, that's a European thing to, I'm okay with that as long as they don't push their lifestyle on me type of responses. And well, now I know your people are all just ridiculous. That's a crazy question. So I don't know where that comes from exactly. I would think, maybe it's a little delusional to think that just because they're atheists, they'd be super, lefty, open-minded, but that's sort of what I expect. But yeah, those are the responses I've got. Some of the responses I've gotten from people trying to join the meetup group.
Mm-hmm.
That is, yeah. This is something that I've actually brought up as a sort of a general question. Like, this is something that I think about all the time, which is like, why are we, members of a marginalized group, marginalizing another marginalized group? Like, why are we doing that? And I've gotten different responses from different people who I've asked about that topic, and they're varied and interesting. But one that my own kind of pet theory is that in the same way you see a lot in the Black community, this sort of idea of like, we got to stick with our own, to the point of being kind of weird about Black people dating white people or people of other races. In that same way, some seem to see gay people, trans people as a threat to population, which is strange and a little eugenics-y, but that's something that I have observed, and it's like I'm just trying to pin down why this is happening, and that's one of the things that I've observed, and it's strange.
Not to be too cliche, but I've always seen it as sort of that phrase that hurt people, you know? When you're like, when you've been hurt, you sort of lash out, and you're not so keen on making sure that the people you're lashing out against are, you know, deserve it. So it's the way I've always seen it.
No, I think that that's a really valuable point here, that when you do push people towards the margins, and especially if there is a lot of just basic disparities in income and leisure time and stress and, you know, all of these kinds of things, people are going to be less progressive. People are going to be less open-minded. And when you have that very like scarcity mentality, when you're pushed out to the margins, you just are more inclined to take from the people around you. Can you speak at all towards that type of pressure on Black folks, and how that might be playing at play here?
Yeah, definitely. I think we've seen examples of like, especially within the Black church, of some Black church leaders telling their congregations how to vote, and like pressuring them that like, this is what we do because this is who we are. I think it's just when you're marginalized, it's just everything becomes distorted, and it's just weird for you. So I think it's hard, and the weird part about it is that as much as, like you said, you're not going to be as progressive when you are marginalized. I think it's sad because I think we as a community would benefit probably a lot more than other people from accepting this sort of more progressive mindset, which is really sad.
Yeah, I've noticed that there is an interesting trend, at least again as far as like voting and politics, that a lot from what I understand, again this is just my own observations, is that a lot of the Black community is like, yeah, of course I'll vote Democrat, and then when LGBT issues come up, they suddenly become very conservative. And it's like,
right. Right,
like, which I think does very much stem from the church.
Yeah, I've always said Black people aren't really liberal. Black people are liberal on Black people issues, like housing rights, mandatory minimum sentences. But when you start talking about like abortion or LGBT issues or the environment, we can sort of fall off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember that was a talking point, rightly or wrongly, that turned into a bit of a football during Pete Buttigieg's nomination process, or run for the nomination in this last election cycle. There was a lot of folks blaming Black America for his lack of access to the nomination. And I don't know how well-founded that is, but there's certainly a reputation here, if nothing else. How earned does that reputation maybe feel?
Well, Black people do tend to vote in a similar way, but I don't think the expectation should be that like we have to, like we're not a monolith, as the expression goes. Like, sure.
I think that part of the problem is it's like when you're voting for your own survival, you kind of have the blinders on to just those issues because those are the most important ones to you. Those are the only ones that some people can, at least in their own minds, afford to care about. because it is it affects them, it affects their daily lives, it affects their family, it affects their future. So they're a lot more focused on issues of racial equality than any other kind of equality, because, you know, that's the most important thing. And of course, there is, you know, the sort of stereotype of a lot of gay white dudes kind of appropriating Black culture, which wouldn't, you know, probably doesn't engender great feelings there.
Sure.
Yeah, it's just kind of a sticky situation all around.
Sure. Well, I mean, pain breeds pain. That's fair to say. I definitely want to talk a little bit more about maybe lingering homophobia in Black atheism, if we can even call it lingering. I think that's a lot to get into. And before we do that, I want to give Rudy a chance to take us to the calls and talk to some of the people who are calling in. While Rudy's getting that pulled up, Kevon, I guess I'm just curious if there is anything in particular that our predominantly white audience maybe doesn't understand about the stigma of homosexuality in Black communities, or if there's anything that you might be able to just kind of highlight for the rest of us here.
Just that it's a complicated issue.
Sure.
We like I said, we're not a monolith, so we haven't figured. I don't think we figured anything out as far as this particular issue. So it's just difficult and complicated. And I know a lot of white people are always like, "Oh, well, I can't really. Should I talk about this?" I mean, even sometimes I think about certain issues. Should I talk about this? But I think it's okay to talk to people as long as you're coming from a good place, and recognize that, you know, it's complicated. And just because, you know, you're white doesn't mean you can't talk about it. And just because you're maybe talking to a Black person doesn't mean that they've figured it out themselves.
Yeah, that bigotry, no matter what community it's coming from, is bigotry. And we can be, you know, mindful of our own privileges and sort of aware of the conversation that we're walking into, if it's a community or whatever else that we're not a part of. But that ultimately bigotry is bigotry, hate is hate, and that we have a responsibility to acknowledge that or call that out.
Yeah.
Yep.